Hello, and we are live. Welcome to the Bloodstream. Before we get the ball rolling here, I'll be very quick. A couple of things to announce. We are going to try and do a viewer Q&A toward the end of tonight's show. If you want to jump on and speak to my guest face to face, digitally at least, I'll make that link available later on. That link is already available to my patrons and channel members. If you have a question that you'd like to just type out in the chat, please hold those until then or send them via super chat. Super chats, of course, support the channel, and YouTube keeps track of all super chats so I can refer to them when the time comes. So, without further ado, let me bring on my guest. He needs no introduction. He is an actor, a producer, and a director. It is my great pleasure to be joined today by Keith Gordon. How you doing, sir?
Hello, very glad to be here.
It is a pleasure. I have had actors on my channel, I've had directors on my channel, but I've never had anyone who transitioned from acting to directing. So I'm really excited to have this time to speak with you. And of course, you've worked with some just incredible people in your career.
Yeah, I've been extremely lucky. Reality of the film business is, hard work counts and talent counts, and all, but a lot of it has to do with luck too. And I've been very lucky. Got to work with a lot of great people, learned a lot from a lot of wonderful folk. It's been a really good ride. By the way, apropos of nothing, your opening graphics and music are super cool.
Oh,
I don't know if that was something you designed or something you took from something, but it's really cool.
well, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, yeah. I pieced it together, and my buddy Keith did the music. So,
Really nice.
well, thank
Really
you. I
nice.
appreciate that. Appreciate that. Well, let's go ahead and let's let me start picking your brain here. All of my previous guests have had a desire to get into one facet or another of show business, of course. But the thing that they've all had in common is the moment where they decide to pursue that dream. You're unique in this regard too, I think, because unlike my other guests, both your parents were already in show business when you decided to hop on too.
Yeah, my folks were much more out of the theater than out of film. I mean, but they were certainly in show business. They had worked, a lot in New York theater. They actually were both part of the initial comedy group called Compass, which became Second City. I mean, Second City is really famous now, but before that, there was Compass, and it was them with Mike Nichols and Elaine May and Barbara Harris and kind of all these amazing people. So they had this, their theater stuff goes back forever. And my mom basically quit when I was born. And then after I moved out, she kind of went back and did some voiceover work and stuff, but she never went back full time. My dad kept working, and he was one of those guys. He's one of those classic New York character actors that you've probably seen and stuff. He did a lot of commercials. That was really what paid the rent, was doing lots of commercials. But he was like guest starred on a lot of TV shows in the 70s and the 80s. And but his love was always theater, and that's what he always went back to. So I sort of grew up around showbiz, but what's funny was that I was much more drawn to film. I mean, I did work in the theater, but it wasn't as much, it wasn't my first love.
Mm.
Basically, with me, what happened was, when I was a little kid, I was 7 years old, and I was a big rocket ship science fan. And 2001, A Space Odyssey came out, and my dad, being a nice dad, said, "Oh, well, it's a rocket ship movie. I'll take him to that." And so we went opening weekend, and of course, I was way too young to understand it, but I understood that I didn't understand it, and that blew my mind. And I was terrified by it and fascinated by it, and I dragged my poor father back over and over and over again. And that was what sort of started me down the road, because it was like the first time I'd ever seen a film where it was like, oh my God, this isn't like just, I'd seen like little kids' films and stuff. And so you know, but seeing something that just stretched my brain that way just was so exciting. And that started a love affair. And then, as I kept getting older, I kept watching more and more movies, and going to old movies. I'm old enough that New York was full of revival houses when I was
Mm.
young, when I was like my teens and stuff. So me and my friends would go like every weekend and often after school, and we'd go and watch old movies of every kind. And then I worked as an intern when I was a teenager in the Museum of Modern Art, because they have one of the best libraries about film in the world. And so I'd go there and, unpaid, and help them file stories. This is way back before there was even microfiche. They actually just had pieces of paper cut out from like different newspapers and film magazines, and I'd file it. And then in exchange, they would like show me films. They would, like, if I had a special film I wanted to see, once in a while, they would like set it up so I could just sit there and watch it, which is really cool.
Oh,
Um,
so
so
2001 was kind of that movie that was
yes, in
that
fact,
the I
I'm wearing my Hell 9000 T-shirt as a because I knew that would end up coming up, because it always does. So
wa
um,
was that the movie that made you want to get into
yeah, I
acting,
mean, I think I
directing,
was
the whole
too young to fully understand that, oh, I want to do. I just knew I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen, and I
Mhm.
wanted to see it again and again. And then that led to watching all sorts of other movies, and this ever-growing feeling of, okay, not only do I love watching them, but wouldn't it be amazing to get to make them? But I didn't really know what the path was, because again, my parents were more theater people. They didn't know anything about putting together movies, so I was around it, but I wasn't. It wasn't like I had people who were in the film side of the business who could say, "Well, if you wanted to do that, here's what you would do."
Right.
And I just got super lucky. I was in the basically the short version is I was in a school play, and one of the parents of one of the other kids was Lloyd Richards, who used to run the National Playwrights Conference, which was this yearly. It was sort of what the Sundance Film Lab does with films, the National Playwrights Conference does with plays. They bring playwrights from all over, and they work on their plays with professional actors, and they show them to an audience in progress. And they were having real trouble casting this one role of a kid, but it was a really juicy role. And Lloyd saw me in this school play and went, "Oh, he might be right for this part we're having so much trouble casting." So they called me in. I auditioned. I got the part, and that's really what started me off. I was 15. I spent the summer doing that play, but also several other plays up there, working with amazing directors and actors, and Diane Wiest was there, and Ed Herman, and all these kind of great people.
Did you direct some of the plays too? I heard you
Oh
had
no, no, I
directed
was a
some.
kid. No, I was just there to be an actor. I
Oh, okay.
was, the directing. I worked primarily as an actor until into my 20s. I
Mhm.
started as a teenager, and I love. I mean, even before I got any professional work, I was making Super 8 movies with my friends. I mean, again, for most of you out there, you won't know Super 8 was very, very small film. And it was what was around. We didn't have video. We didn't have, so, we would take like short stories. And I remember making sort of this wacky comedy about a beauty pageant, and then I adapted a Ray Bradbury short story. And most of them never got finished, because like the equipment was terrible, and you were editing with little pieces of tape, and nothing ever quite worked right. But it was great. It was like we would all have fun. And then my school got a video camera when I was about the same age, about 15 or so, 14. They let us borrow. So we started doing like this. We sort of did our imitation Monty Python group, which we called Grape Juice on the Rocks. And we would do these little sketches and, film them with a video camera. And so, I was already loving doing that, but I just had no idea about if that ever would or could go from there to actually getting to make films one day.
Mm.
But I got this remarkably lucky break of starting to work as an actor. I did that play. That got me an agent. That got me a reading for Jaws 2. I got the part in Jaws 2. I spent a year on Jaws 2,
Oh
because
yeah,
they kept, you know,
yeah, I definitely want to go into detail about Jaws too, because I love that movie. I think that was the first movie I ever saw you in. But did your mother and father, they came mostly from theater, some television, but I'm sure they kind of knew the trials and tribulations of the
oh,
business, the ups and
sure.
downs. So when you said that you were wanted to get into the business, were they encouraging? Were they discouraging? Did they sort of give you the rundown of
It
you
was very mixed messages, to be
Mhm.
honest. What they said was, "Don't do this. It's awful. It's a really tough life. Most people don't succeed. It's mean and miserable and all that." But there also was this sort of unsaid thing where I could feel that they were very proud and very excited. It was definitely one of those odd, do as I say, don't do as I do, or do as. Basically, it was both. And which was great because it was honest. I mean, they were right. It is a really mean, rough business, but it was also something I was lucky enough that I did well at. And but it was always tough. My dad and I, it was a very competitive thing for a while between us. And he did direct me in a play, and but he'd also be my harshest critic. Like most kids, like
Mhm.
would be in a would do do something, and their parents would be, oh, it's so great. My dad would like give me 2 hours worth of notes, and so it was a very complicated relationship around the work. Uh, and I dropped out of school when I was 16. And again, verbally they were like, you can't do this, you can't, but they didn't really stop me. And I also moved out and got my own apartment, so they didn't really have much of a choice anyway, because I
They
had done Jaws 2, put away all the money I made on that, and went, okay, I'm not going to go move back home. And I went back to school, and I was like, oh, this is so weird to be in high school. I've been an adult living on my own, working for a year. So I just basically dropped it, which again, I always, even now when I talk to students and stuff, I say, like, don't follow my example. I was so lucky that didn't completely screw up my life. But I was 16. You were full of bravado, and you think you know
Right.
everything, and so.
Yeah.
But man, the dice came up right that I happened to be able to make a living and not regret that choice. So.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that you were discovered by someone in the casting department for Jaws 2 while doing a play. I
Well,
imagine.
I did the play, and I got an agent, and the agent submitted me to the
Oh,
casting.
okay.
So that
Okay.
was, when I did the play at the National Playwrights Conference, an agent happened to be there. They said, "Hey, we'd like to represent you, send you out for some stuff." And they sent me out for Jaws 2. And it was at that point John Hancock was the director,
Mm.
not Jano Schwark, who ended up being the actual director. And I auditioned, like a bunch of times for a part that I had like 2 lines at that point. But they were putting different combinations of the kids in that movie together. And they ended up asking me to do it, and I was blown away. And it was supposed to be like a 4-week job, and it ended up being an 11-month job because the film was a mess in terms of production. They fired John Hancock halfway through shooting. They threw out all the footage. They started over again. They rewrote the script. They were typhoons and hurricanes destroyed the sets. I mean, it was like one of those, if it could go wrong, it did go wrong movies.
Mhm.
But
Well,
again, I was 60 years old. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I mean, to me, the problems were like, if I like now, my mind would be melting, and I'd be, oh my god, get me out of here. We were in the middle
uh
of nowhere, we were in the Florida Panhandle. We weren't even near any big towns. But to me, it was like the best thing you could possibly be doing is like being in a movie in the middle of nowhere, and I went
yeah.
and hung out at the editing room all day when I wasn't shooting. So it was heaven.
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody I think knows about the well documented production problems of the first movie, but Jaws 2 had their own. I mean, you mentioned it. Yeah, John Hancock was hired to direct. He got fired early on. There were major script revisions. There was a hurricane. The shark didn't work on this one either. Roy Scheider and the second director, Jano Schwark, were reportedly at each other's throats um, all the
Well, it
time.
was it was I mean, I think Roy pretty openly just didn't wanna be there. I
Mm.
mean, the other I mean, Robert Shaw was dead, from the first movie. I mean, he was still alive in real life at that point, but his character was dead, and Dreyfuss didn't have anything in his contract that made him have to do a sequel. So he was like, "No, I don't wanna do a sequel." So poor Roy was the only person who was like, "Yeah, you don't have a choice. When you signed, you agreed to do a sequel if we ask you to, so we're asking you to." So he was, not happy about. I liked Roy. I mean, he was super cool, but he was not thrilled about being in Florida for what ended up being 11 months
Do you
doing a movie.
privy Were you privy to any headbutting from those 2 on the set?
There was, although I think looking back, it was more Roy's frustration with the situation. I mean, there was 1 or 2 blow-ups, but I just think Roy wasn't happy with being there. I don't think the bad blood between him and Jeannot was deep.
Mm,
I think they mostly got along fine. I think a couple of times Roy was just fed up with the whole thing. And so, sometimes with an actor that'll happen where, I mean, look, as a director, I've experienced that. An actor will just be frustrated that they were told they were going to be done a week earlier, and they made plans to do things with their family, and then the next thing you know, they're screaming at you, and you kind of realize, yeah, you're not really screaming at me. You're just kind of
at the
pissed off
situation.
about the situation. And that was what I had the sense, because they mostly worked together perfectly fine. And Jeannot's a very easygoing guy. mean, he's not like a difficult director. So it wasn't like he would do stuff that would, some directors you watch and go, yeah, well, no wonder the actor's getting cranky. But Janot was not that. I think just Roy was like, oh my God, I've been here 6 months. I've got other projects that I'm missing out on. So if a day went bad for any reason, if there were technical problems, he would just already be
Yeah.
like,
He
I don't want to be here.
he'd gone through it before with the first film. The damn shark's still not working. I'm still here. I'm seasick. Get me the hell out of here.
Yeah, and the shark thing, yeah, they made the mistake of trying to get fancier with the shark, and of course, part of what makes the first film so genius, and they had tons of troubles with the shark on the first one too, but is that Spielberg so got the less is more thing, that you only saw bits of the shark, and on Jaws 2, they decided we want to really see the shark a lot. But that's really problematic because when you've got a big hydraulic shark, it only looks good for so long before it starts looking like a big hydraulic shark.
Right.
And so not only did it tend to do things like sink to the bottom of the ocean and take days to dredge back up, but it also, a lot of things they initially planned, I think they didn't look as good as they might have hoped, because if you stared at it more than a few seconds, you went, oh, it's a big plastic shark. So it was definitely challenging on a few levels, but it did also just tend to sink a lot. I mean, whatever the thing they built for it, just if the seas were too rough or whatever, you'd see a bunch of bubbles come up, and they go, all right, everybody, we're going back to shore, and and then they started like having to come up with things to shoot, because they couldn't just be like showing nothing being shot, so they were like writing scenes to shoot on the days while they were trying to dredge up the shark, and so it was a mess of a production. But like I say, I was 16. I was like hanging out in the editing room. I'd go watch every day that I could, even if I wasn't in the scene. So my part isn't very big, but because I was somebody who wanted to know about making movies, I would just go and sit and watch for hours and hours. They also made us practice sailing for hours and hours. That was their default thing when like something went wrong. It's like, okay, go practice. So we would basically sail back and forth in front of the Navarro Beach Holiday Inn for 8 or 10 hours, which can, your brain can melt.
Do you remember what John Hancock's vision of the film was? Because I understand once he left the picture, there were major script revisions.
Yeah, it's funny. It wasn't like the story changed radically. I think, what's funny is I don't know that John wouldn't have made a perfectly good movie. I mean, I was actually, I don't remember if I was seeing his dailies. I mean, once we were shooting with Janot, I went to the dailies all the time because they had this open, movies are different. Some movies, back when they would project the dailies in a movie theater, some directors don't want the actors to see it. Some directors are fine with it. And Janot was like, yeah, you want to come see them? Come see them. So I did that all the time. But with John, I think, I don't know, the script, there was more. I think they changed the ratio of dialogue to action. I think they made it more of an action-y movie after he left. But what's funny is, and I wish I could remember all the specifics, really, a lot of it was the same universe. I mean, there was still the shark going after a water skier. That was in John's version. There were still the kids getting caught out on the ocean in a raft. It was mostly all the dialogue changed and how long certain sequences were, how much they built, how much, there was more stuff in John's version around the town, the land, the politics of the town, the kids, love lives and stuff on land, which is all still in the final movie. But there was a lot more of it in John's version and a lot less of the time out on the water. I mean, the time out on the water definitely got bigger when Janot came in, and Carl Gottlieb, who wrote the first one, came in and did a big rewrite. But a lot of it was just also the writing. I mean, John's wife, Dorothy Tristan, had written the first draft. And I think there was arguments about whether the writing was right, the right tone, the right feel, the right, was it too jokey? Was it too this? Was it too that? And I wasn't part of any of those discussions. So, but basically, even if a scene happened that happened in both versions, they were written in a very different way. And Carl, having written the first one, really knew the voice of the film. I mean, he came in and immediately it did seem more to my eye like, oh, this feels like the feel of the dialogue and stuff from the first movie.
Yeah, I understand. You mentioned that there was you had a lot of time on your hands making this movie. Again, it was supposed to be 4 weeks and it turned into almost a year. I understand that you and the rest of the cast, the young cast may have passed the time by getting into certain things. Um,
Well, not me. I was
relation.
younger than everybody, which was really hard. I was like 16 and everybody else was 18, 19, 20. So I was the kid brother. I desperately wanted to lose my virginity on Jaws too, and I will be honest that I didn't. Because everybody, yeah, was having affairs and they were drinking and they were partying and they were, and I was like the kid, So yeah, I kind of, I was the one that female members of the cast would come to my room at 1 in the morning to weep about the breakup they just had with the other guy in the cast, and I'd be sitting there going, "You could stay here," but that never really worked. And then there were waitresses at the restaurant that I would flirt with, and I would go and they'd invite me to their trailer, and we'd watch a movie, and I think, oh, maybe I'm going to get to stay the night, and then they'd say, "Okay, well, I'll take you back now," and I'm like, what? So I was just a little bit on the young side for being really part of the in crowd. So it was frustrating because I was like, a couple of years older, I probably would have had a much wilder time.
Mm.
But instead, there were a couple of people I was really friendly with. Both Tom Dunlop and Billy Van Zandt were good friends and have stayed good friends. And we would kind of send each other funny notes, and we sort of had the run of the hotel. We were in the Navarro Beach Holiday Inn, which is kind of the middle of nowhere. It's about 40 miles from Pensacola, is the biggest town anywhere nearby. So like we could like put each other's notes in each other's mailboxes, and it was basically the Jaws 2 hotel. So there was a lot of laughing, and Billy and I wrote a kind of spoofy script about it called Jaws 2.5 that got circulated, and made fun of everybody, but hopefully we never pissed anybody off too bad because we tried to be nice to people. But it was, so I had a blast, but no, I didn't get to have the Hollywood life that a lot of those guys were having. I was the little brother,
But
which I'm sorry about.
even then though, you were in the editing room and you were seeing how things were getting put together and
Well, that was thrilling because they had an on-site. They took up a couple of the suites in the hotel, and they put the editing room in there. And Neil Travis, who's a wonderful editor, was very kind with the fact that I was very interested in filmmaking, and so he sort of would let me go and hang out, and I would see. One of the things that, especially with a suspense movie or an action movie or when it's being shot, it often doesn't look that scary. It doesn't look that good. The blood looks funny. It's very, it can really be misleading. And what part of it was fascinating was watching them fashion, taking all the good pieces and putting them together. And suddenly something that while we were shooting, I thought, oh, is that going to look really dorky? Suddenly go, oh, actually, that's cool. And I had that experience a number of times because working with De Palma, I had that with. But it's funny because I've seen people who've like visited sets or seen sets where like there's a horror thing or a violence and almost always it's like, oh, that doesn't look very real, and they'll come over to me and say, is that supposed to be scary? Because I thought that was like, and people are amazed by what editing does and
uh,
how important editors are always so important, but especially on a film that involves any kind of suspense or build up. And so it was a real education to go sit in that editing room and just watch them make those choices. And so that was great. And then I'd go out when I wasn't going to the editing room. I'd go out and hang out because my character was only in so much of the movie. So I'd go and hang out watching them shooting scenes and seeing how Jeannot directed and seeing how they lit things and whatever. It was sort of paid film school. I mean, a lot of my early years in the business, because I knew I wanted to direct. I was actually worked on a screenplay. One of the things I did while we were there is I adapted a book, into a screenplay, and I would do that with my time. And so it was a great film school because I got paid and I got to be with a bunch of professionals who were actually doing it instead of just hearing about it in theory. So I
yeah.
was very grateful for all that.
Oh, right on. I have to tell you, the first time I got on a boat, it was actually a pontoon, but close enough. I couldn't help but do the Mr. Christian, pump up this boat. And nobody had any idea what the hell I was doing, but I was like, I just had to do that.
Well, and it was and mine was like I did the world's worst Charles Lawton imitation to begin with. So it's like even somebody who like knows movies could be freaking like, what the hell is he doing? So, but yeah, it was great fun. Although I will say the attack on my little boat got very scary at times because I got caught up in the wire when the boat got knocked over. I got caught up in the wires of the truck. I actually got off pretty easy. There was a number of times on that film that the safety. I mean, Hollywood's changed a lot, and this level of safety concern and precaution in that movie would be really different today, because you had a bunch of young people and even kids, and we're out on the real water, and there's, I mean, the first day we were shooting in the water, where we're swimming in the water, I'm in the water and I hear somebody, they were shooting off this big barge, and I hear somebody go, "Look, a real one!" And there's like a fin going through the water, not that
Oh my
far
God.
away. As it turned out, it was a manta ray, which was very cool, but
Mhm.
it was terrifying. And there was not a lot of like divers in the water or whatever. It was definitely a different era. I mean,
Yeah.
definitely was an era where they were nowhere near as, oh, let's be really careful, as they are now.
Well, were you intimidated by the shark? I mean, it looks like a big giant shark, one, but also, I mean, it's a big heavy piece of machinery that didn't always do what it was supposed to do.
Well, the second part was the intimidating part. Looking like a shark was not very scary, because in real life, again, when you were there, the thing was not, you know. But they had two maiden sharks. They had the sort of shark that was on a platform and didn't move very much, but it was hydraulic, and it did all the mouth closing and opening and all that stuff. But that one wasn't even that scary in a danger way, because it could only move very little bit. It was like something you'd see on a Disneyland sort of ride. It looked great. It was designed to be very good to look at close, but it couldn't do a lot of swimming. Then there was the sled shark, which I always thought was the most effective thing, because that could be towed at 25, 30 miles an hour by a big boat. And that thing would cut through the water and look much more like a real shark. Now, it didn't if you completely stopped it and photographed it in close up, but if you were going along next to the fin coming up out of the water, or that stuff looked great. But if it was crashing into you or dragging you, or that was scary, because it was going through the water really fast, and it would sometimes sink to the bottom, and it wasn't, and you
Yeah.
could, so that stuff was creepy. And like when it hit my boat and I got tied up in it, that was the sled shark. So I got knocked over, and definitely my foot got caught, only for a few seconds, but enough to be like, oh, this could turn really bad. And then it was fine. Because there's cables and stuff dragging the thing, that one was a little bit scary to work with. Uh,
Mhm.
didn't have much in the way of real shark sightings. Once or twice, I think we saw like some small sharks, in the water, but nothing that would be like nurse sharks and things like that. Nothing that were particularly man-eater scary.
Mhm.
I did have a lamprey, which is the things that clamp onto sharks,
Oh,
fall in love with my boat. It was very funny. I had that little blow up dinghy, and for a while, every time I go out, I would see this little guy next to me. He kind of looks like a shark, but they're not. They're sort of upside down, and he would just come out once in a while and then go back under my boat. And I always felt like bad, like, because I had to go back to shore. And it's like, oh, he thinks he's found a ride to live with, and I don't know if it's the same one I saw all the time, but I like to think I got adopted by this fish. I have no idea if I did.
well, I mean, of course, Jaws 2 was the sequel to the biggest box office hit of all time at that point. What was the hype like around the release of that film? I imagine it had to be
Oh,
huge.
it was the hype. I mean, when it came out, of course, when you're making the film, that stuff's not going on. But in the lead up to the release, there was tons of screenings and parties, and again, I didn't have a big enough. I mean, the hype around the actors was really focused, as it should be, around Roy and around,
Right.
it was, so the kids, we weren't we didn't get a ton of attention. But it was cool, because again, I'd never been involved in a big Hollywood movie, and I'd never gone to a premiere, and I'd never gone. It was great. I mean, we were, I think the Chinese in Hollywood was the big premiere party, or one of them, or maybe it was the Egyptian, but it was neat. I mean, it was definitely an experience. But I don't think they knew how it was going to do. It ended up doing very well. It ended up making a lot of money. I mean, not as well as the first, but it was
Mhm.
ultimately a very, very profitable film. But sequels were not as common or big a business in the same way that Jaws, the first Jaws, broke all sorts of records for box office, but also was one of the first films to go wide. Like now, it's normal for movies to open in thousands of theaters. That was pretty weird when they did it with Jaws. That was not how you normally do it. You'd normally open a film in New York and LA, and slowly let the reviews build and build out around. And with Jaws, I think, because the book had been such a huge success and all that, they figured, let's just get it out there and get the audiences in. And it worked. That strategy worked. So, but Jaws 2 is one of the first mega sequels. So again, I think they were pushing it, but I think there was also a little bit of nervousness, like, well, what if everybody hates it and no one goes? So you got the feeling that they were very excited, but you also got the feeling that they were ready to like bail if like opening weekend happened and nobody went.
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of that internal thing. Again, for an actor with a small part, I wasn't in the middle of much of any of that.
Mhm.
I was more on the outside looking in too, and kind of just listening. And of course, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have all. Now you can, if you're interested in movies and what's going on, you can find out all sorts of stuff. Back then, it's like you bought Variety once a week, and you could read about like what was happening with your movie.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure most people know about you working with Brian De Palma on Dress to Kill, but that's actually not the first time you had worked with him or with Nancy Allen for that matter. Tell us about home movies.
Well, home movies was again a dream project for me as a wannabe filmmaker. Brian was teaching filmmaking, independent filmmaking at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York. And he had what I think was kind of a brilliant idea, which is instead of teaching a class in a classroom, let's make a movie. Let me use the students and actually have them be a big part of making a film, so they can actually see how it works, not just hear how it works. So Brian, and people don't remember this about Brian unless they're real fans, but Brian started in comedy. He started his early films like Greetings and Hi Mom, and were kind of these weird, slightly surreal, crazy comedies. And then he transitioned into more focus on horror and suspense. So he took out an old story he'd written back in those days. It was a wacky comedic story about sort of based on his own family growing up. I mean, very exaggerated, but and then he had parts of his class. They wrote the script from his story, and then when the film actually got made, they were the art department. They were much of the camera department. I mean, basically, there were very few professionals hired. It was almost all these film students, which was super cool. And I got hired as an actor. And in fact, it almost didn't happen. Like everything in this business, it's luck and weirdness, because my agents called me and they said, well, they're casting for this student movie. And it's Brian De Palma's class, so you might get to meet him if you did it. So maybe, do you want to go on audition? And I was like, I started really working a lot. I thought, I don't want to do a student movie. That's going to. And then they said, well, they're doing the auditions on your block. I was living on West 72nd Street, and they were literally doing the auditions on West 72nd Street, like 100 yards from my apartment building. So I was like, all right, why not? And I walked down there and I auditioned, but it was only the students. And certainly the impression they were giving was that Brian was only vaguely involved. And then I got a call going, and it was actually from Scott Rudin, who was the casting director, who was also very much a kid at that point, now one of the biggest producers in the world. But at that point, he was like, 20 or something. I don't know, and so they were like, well, we'd like you to come down and meet Brian and maybe read for him. And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And I guess he's more involved than I thought. And so I went down to he had this apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York, which was really his office apartment. And I read for him and I read with Nancy. And what became clear is that Brian was directing the movie. And they were just keeping that very quiet because they didn't want to get a lot of, too much attention ahead of time. They didn't want the DGA kind of going, well, what are you doing directing this little student movie? And so they were at that point keeping it very low, that Brian was actually going to be really the director, and that the students were going to be doing second unit and picking up shots. But so I was suddenly very happy that I decided to walk halfway down the block to audition, because Brian was certainly a film hero at that point already. And so it was like, oh my God, okay, I could get to be in a Brian De Palma movie. And I read for him with Nancy, and then I think they called me back another time, and I got the part, which was like amazing. And then the experience of making the film was great because, first of all, it was a film, but it was a film class, and I wanted to be a filmmaker. And I basically said to Brian, I want to be a filmmaker. Can I be like one of the class? Can I follow you around and ask questions and be annoying and come to the editing room? And he was like, yeah, sure, of course. Yeah. So it was remarkable in that sense because it was making a movie, but it was a class. So I couldn't have gotten a better job. And also it was full of relationships that became big parts of my life. So, I mean, one of the students became a woman that I lived with for 7 years. Another of the young people who wasn't a student but had been a PA on one of Brian's movies in Chicago is Mark Romanek. And Mark Romanek became a good friend, and we did a film together that we wrote together, and he directed and I co-produced, and that was my first step into not just acting. And so it was a huge movie in my life in a lot of ways, and it was a blast. I mean, I got to work with Nancy, who's like one of the nicest human beings in the world. I got to work with Kirk Douglas, who was a trip, and it was Kirk Douglas. It was freaking Spartacus, and I'm like in this little movie with him. And Vince Gardino was a fabulous New York actor. I mean, it was really it was great. It was one of those things. If somebody said, draw up the ideal job for you to have now, it would have been that job. Working with a great director, a wonderful cast, on a project where it's expected that you're going to ask questions and want to look through the lens and see what the shot looked like. And so it was amazing. And Brian was wonderful, and I learned so much being around him, watching him, working with him. A lot of things that I do as director today came out of things that I got from working with him. And then not long after that, it was a little while. We finished the film, and he was prepping to do Dress to Kill, and I got this call. I think it was directly from him. It might have been from the casting director first, and then he called, but saying that they had this part that was originally written for like a 10-year-old, and they were really having trouble casting it. They were that when they would read people for it, it just didn't feel believable, and it felt really just not right. And so Brian started to think maybe he would go a little older with it. And so we'd had this good time working together. And he said, they were like, would you come in and read? And just know you may not get this part. We may keep it young. We don't know. I was about 18 at that point. But he said, Brian would like to at least see. So I came in, and again, Nancy and I read together. And it's funny. One of the things that we did, and I think works in that movie really well, is he ended up saying, yeah, let's go with you. Let's say he's 16, not 11 or whatever it was supposed to be. But he did a smart thing. He didn't rewrite the dialogue much. He didn't change much. And instead we used that stuff to be ironic. And like I was much more flirtatious, certainly with Nancy's character than the kid in the script, but we played it all as subtext. So like, even with, when Angie Dickinson says, I'll tell your grandmother you're working on your Peter, in the original, it kind of felt like the kid didn't get the joke. And I could just play with getting the joke, and that it was much more an older kid and a mom being able to joke about sex. Or with Nancy, when she was like, you want to spend the night here, there was more of a little bit of like, oh my God, is she but Brian made the smart choice not to write for that. Just, he said, you guys play the reality of a smart 16-year-old kid, not of a 11-year-old kid who has no idea. And that I thought worked really well. And I think it actually adds some layers to that character and that relationship. And again, it was old home week, so it was great. It was a wonderful experience too, because I'd already worked with Brian, and whenever you work with people that you really like, again, it's always fun. You've got a shorthand, how each other works. Nancy was so easy, and then Michael Caine was like the nicest guy in the world too, which was another huge thing for me, because another huge movie hero. I mean, like, I was so scared to even speak to him. And most easygoing, funny, love to tell dirty jokes. Impressive dedication to his craft. He was there. He would often come on days that he wasn't shooting and kind of watch what was going on and kind of see what the vibe was. And you don't see that in star actors a lot, but he really seemed interested in the movie. He wasn't there. He wasn't just collecting a paycheck. He was actually really and he was very kind, I guess. We only had one little scene together where I'm outside in the police office where Dennis Franz is talking to Nancy, and I'm sitting outside spying. And so I was being a young method actor, so I sat there for hours. I said, I don't want to stand in, let me just sit there and kind of get in the mood. My mother's been killed, and I have to do all the secretive stuff. And so I was just sitting there, and Michael came over in the quietest voice. He's like, listen, if there's anything that I can do for you, or if there's anything you need from my performance, just let me know. And it was like, what a generous, sweet, kind thing to do. I was this kid, and that was the kind of guy that he always seemed to be. I'm sorry I've never gotten to work with him again, because he just seems so remarkable, and he continues to do incredible work 40 years later. And so it was great. It was great. And so that was 2 movies with Brian. 2 movies with one of the most visually brilliant filmmakers in America. So just watching and asking questions and hanging out was, again, I was in heaven.
Yeah, I love a lot of Brian De Palma's work. Blowout, Dress to Kill, Body Double. It's just too bad that, even now when people talk about De Palma, they can't help but bring up the comparison to Hitchcock, and that he's a Hitchcock wannabe or whatever. But for me, and I think you're on the same boat. Film is a visual medium, but he makes it so much more of a visual medium than just about any other filmmaker. And Dress to Kill is a perfect example of that, because of all the different split screens and different, I forget what they call it, the different focusing.
Split diopters, which he would use all the time, which is, that's when you can have something very close in focus and then something far away in focus at the same time. There's like a little line on the lens, and it's basically it's a filter that goes in front of the lens, and it lets you split the focus. And it's tricky as hell, because you have to hide it. The other way you can see the line. So, I love using them too as a director, but they always cost you some time, because you're like, okay, how do we bury where that split happens?
Yeah.
But yeah, he was an amazing visualist. And look, the Hitchcock thing, I mean, Brian sort of asked for it too, because he did borrow from Hitchcock, and he admitted he borrowed from Hitchcock. He said, "Hey, the guy was like the best suspense filmmaker of all time. You'd be an idiot not to borrow from Hitchcock." But he'd also, he worked with Bernard Herrmann. He worked with, I mean, he did things where it was always seemed to be a little bit of the having your cake and eat it too, because he would get annoyed at the comparisons. But he also did things where it's like, well, you're using the same composer, you're doing some of the same narrative tricks. So of course people are going to talk about you. And I think part of him probably didn't mind being compared to the greatest suspense filmmaker of all time. I think it was a complicated thing for him because I think he wanted to be seen as his own man. But I think he loved Hitchcock. So of course it was an influence. And he even talks about that. And I haven't seen it in a bit, but I really advise for everybody watching, if you're interested in Brian's work, there's the film that Noah Baumbach and I forget who did it with him did on Brian, which is basically just 2 hours of Brian talking. It's just called De Palma. And he tells great stories, and he's ruthlessly honest about himself and the people he works with. But it's a really wonderful portrait of a filmmaker. And so if you're interested in his body of work, that's an amazing resource. And I think he addresses the Hitchcock thing in there a bunch.
Yeah, my friend Stone, who's actually watching this in the chat, he mentioned that documentary, and I've seen that documentary, and it is a very fascinating sort of look into the mind of De Palma. So if you're a fan of his, I would certainly recommend it.
Yeah, it's great. He's a great storyteller too. There's some directors who are brilliant directors, but they don't. Brian tells a good yarn at the same time that he's also a brilliant filmmaker.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. You've done 2 films with Brian De Palma now, who's a huge filmmaker. You've been in Jaws 2. You've worked alongside people like Michael Caine and Angie Dickinson. Did you feel at this point like, I'm kind of taking off here? Did you call your folks and be like, "Hey, I think I'm going to be all right"?
Yeah. Well, I think, I think I talk to my folks all the time, and again, it was always a mixed message thing, because I think, like I say, I think my dad was real competitive with me, especially around that point when I was young, but getting a lot of film work, and he'd never gotten like big juicy roles in movies, so he was very proud, and I think also very jealous, and so it was a little touchy because he sort of wanted to know what's going on, but I could see it was also sort of painful for him at times. And I mean, we had a complicated relationship because of that for a long time. I mean, it took quite a while for it to be like, okay, it's not.
He never said, "Look, Keith, can you put in a word with me with Brian?"
No, he didn't. But I'm sure he had the thought and then hated that he had the thought. And we ended up in a very good place, my dad and I. So before he passed, we got very close. So, there was a long time where that had been. It was a real strange strain between us. So they were pleased I was doing well, but if anything, they would say, "Just remember, this can all end in a minute." And that it was much more. That was the message I get from them, which was like, "Guys, I'm neurotic enough already. I don't really need to be constantly reminded that this could all end in a minute." Because of course, the older I got, and I was still only a kid when this was going on, but I was getting older and seeing how the business worked, and I did realize, oh yeah, this is really, things are going great, but they can. I got a lead in a movie, and then I was fired off of it, and then the movie never got made, so that was a relief because it wasn't like they fired the whole movie in the end. But I saw how fast things could go up and down, and for seemingly no good reason, where you just be like, one day everything's great, and then I just got a call saying, "Oh yeah, no, they want to get somebody older. Sorry, you're out." And then I'd say, luckily, in that case, they ended up never making the movie. But so I had a pretty good idea that the dice were coming up good, and I wanted to just enjoy it as much as I could. But I'd also always been comfortable with the idea that I didn't have to be rich and famous to be okay. Pretty early on, I felt like, yeah, I like the work, and it's nice to get some attention. But having been around some movie stars and stuff, I kind of went, wow, that's a hard life. It's hard to be so famous that everywhere you go, there's a crowd of people. And it was, sure, I wouldn't have run away from it, but I also went, yeah, there's a trade-off. I've actually been very happy with the level of notoriety I've had, which is that, people still occasionally come over because they'll recognize me, but it's occasional and it's fun. And usually people who really are into movies. It's not, somebody knows who I am. It's not just that I'm a famous guy. They actually are into film. So there's something to talk about. And so that's been delightful. But, when I've been around people where it's like, they're just big and famous, it's like, wow, that's a weird life.
Yeah,
Uh,
there's definitely kind of a Faustian deal that you make there for that kind of superstardom. I was doing one of these with director Patrick Lussier, who had directed a film with Nicolas Cage, and he was telling us, or no, I'm sorry, it was the writer Todd Farmer who was telling us about, or he was telling me about how they'd gone out to dinner one night after shooting, and that Nick was just besieged with people as soon as they got in the restaurant, that he had to leave immediately. Like he'd ordered food, but he had to leave before food even got there because he was just surrounded by people.
yeah,
And yeah, I couldn't, I
and
mean,
it can get really creepy, and it can get really creepy for women particularly because women tend to pick up fans that are really stalkers. I mean, Teresa Saldana, who I work with on home movies, was shot by a stalker. I
mm,
mean, she lived, but she had health problems the rest of her life, and she wasn't even super famous. I mean, she was in I Want to Hold Your Hand, and she was a working actress, and people kind of knew her. But somebody came to her door and shot her. I mean,
mm,
it's a weird life, and I've been around. I mean, there's a lot of people I've worked with who have security all the time, and it's a strange thing. People, and it seems to me, and there are exceptions to it, but it seems more intense even with TV stars and movie stars, and that's I think changing now that the two are becoming more interchangeable. But like when I was young, I like people like Michael Caine. I think people were more scared to approach because he was a movie star and they're used to seeing him. I think it's a subliminal psychological thing, but he was like
mm,
this big figure. Not that people didn't, but which when I worked with people who were like TV stars, that I think because they were in people's living rooms, there was this bizarre assumed familiarity. Like I would be like, you'd be at a table and somebody would just come and sit down and go, "Hey, how you doing? I wanted to join you guys." And it's like, that it was like, okay, that's weird. And so I think people who had TV careers really had that more. I mean, even I think even just being around Michael Caine and Angie, Angie had just been doing Police Woman, and there was just this next level of familiarity that I think fans would have that felt a little like, wow, there's no boundary there at all. Like they think you know them the way they know
yeah,
you.
yeah,
So it was interesting to sort of see all that in play. But yeah, I was never obsessed with being big and famous, or I figured if I could make enough to live on and enjoy it, and I could be doing good work with good people, I was really happy.
mm,
And so I've been able to really enjoy all the ups and downs. I mean, I've had scared moments. There've been moments when things got slow, where I was like, "Will I ever work again? Will I be able to pay the rent?" But it's never gotten too bad. Um, and then transitioning into directing is a whole other thing because that's a much longer drawn out process.
mm,
Acting life is so funny because you get a job, and most jobs, Jaws 2 is 11 months. Most jobs are a handful of weeks, and then you're out of work again. Whether you're a big famous star or an unknown, doing two lines, they're quick, and then you got a gig, and then okay, what's the next gig, and it kind of never stops.
yeah, yeah. Your next gig was Christine. Now, to me, and to so many people who are watching this, John Carpenter is a living legend. I know you're just as much of a film buff as you are a filmmaker. Were you aware of Carpenter's work prior
Oh
to
yeah,
Christine?
oh yeah. No, I mean, you couldn't even be vaguely interested in film at that point and not. I mean, Halloween was, the most successful independent film of all time at that point by a factor
Mhm,
of 1,000.
mhm.
Um, you know, Escape from New York, I thought was like a brilliant movie. I mean, it's this dark, funny, cynical, amazing looking, made for like no money considering how incredible looking it was. So I was very aware. I was actually much more aware of John than I was of Stephen King,
Mm.
because I mean, I was more of a film guy. So I knew who Stephen King was, but I'd read a couple of Stephen King books and I really enjoyed them. But like, I was much more like John Carpenter, really, than I was about Stephen King, really. Um, so yeah, when I got the call that I was auditioning for John, that was really thrilling and scary. And then I read an early version of the book, not an early version, but a pre-release version of the book, and I was like, "Holy crap, this is a great part!" And the script was amazing, and so by the time I walked in, I really wanted to make it happen, and luckily it worked out. I mean, auditioning is a weird process; you never know. Uh,
I
you
I
know,
I heard you actually you covered all the bases when you went to your audition, because I heard that you brought a change of clothes so that you could
I
audition
did.
as nerdy Arnie
Mhm.
and as possessed Arnie.
Yep, I bought a chain. I got, I think, a couple different things I could take on and off because there was such an arc to it. And I thought one of the things I felt like I could do well as an actor was that arc. Like I wasn't neatly on one end of the spectrum or the other. And even on stage and stuff, I played nerds and I played scary. You know, I did a play where I held people hostage for the whole play, and I did plays where I was like the nerdy guy with glasses. And I felt like, okay, well, one of the things I can show off about trying to get this part is that I can play that range. So I came in with glasses. I came in with a leather jacket. I came in with a black T-shirt. I came in with like clothes that didn't fit well. I came, and I worked on like my voice a little bit so that I could let it go up and down and register. So that when Arnie's more vulnerable, he's kind of talking up in here, and then when he's kind of cooler, he's down in here, and have that be a little second nature. And it worked. I mean, they liked it. They got it. They got what I was doing, and John was really intrigued. And I think, but I think as much as anything, it was also that when I auditioned with him, we also work together well, and that's a big part of the audition process. Is like, he would say, well, would you do this, would you do that? And I think he liked the way I responded to those things. I mean, I think when I audition people, I mean, it's not just is someone good, it's do we vibe together? I mean, that's going to be a really close relationship when you're casting a leading role in your film. And it's like when I say something, do they get it, and what do they do with it, and do we, and I felt like, he appreciated that I knew his work, but I think he appreciated that I was a film buff and that I was really into movies. And I mean, he would tease me mercilessly through the whole process about the fact I wanted to be a director. But that was what made working with him great. I mean, he had a really silly, fun sense of humor. I mean, he just was determined to make the process a fun process for himself, but I think also for the people around him. So he would play practical jokes. He would make faces off camera. He would, he was just enjoying it. And here was this great serious filmmaker kind of reminding everybody, we're playing here.
Right.
We're telling a story. This isn't, we don't have to be all grim. And I think that it was a really important part of Christine, because I think Christine has a real sense of humor about itself. And I think if it didn't as a film, it would fall off one end too far.
Right.
He said, we're making a movie about a possessed car. And if we get too self-serious, it'll start seeming silly. Like we have to have enough of a sense of humor so that people don't feel like, oh, come on, it's a possessed car. And it was a brilliant call as a director, because he knew that just a little bit of play, a little bit of humor, a little bit would make you then be able to believe more, not less.
Mhm.
So, the performances are a little over the top intentionally. They're just, there's just a play to that movie that I love,
Yeah.
and that he really sought out as a director. And I think it works really well. I think it really complements the film.
Well, it's interesting that you say that he had such a playful kind of way about him because, a lot's been said about like this Carpenter's state of mind following the commercial and critical failure of The Thing, and it's been reported that, on Christine was not Christine was he just needed to keep working after The Thing failed. And it was a gig, his heart wasn't in it, yada yada yada. But, it's good to hear from somebody who was actually there saying that no, he was.
Yeah, no, his heart seemed very in it. I mean, I think the approach was different. He got away from doing a studio movie, and Christine was really an independent film. It was a negative pickup with Columbia, but that means Columbia wasn't there. Columbia wasn't standing over his shoulder telling him what to do. The budget was much smaller than a lot of films that had that much special effects. No, I think it was about 8 million, and at that time, that was already a pretty small budget for a special effects laden movie. So I think he cared a lot about getting his independence and not going through, feeling so the spotlight. But yeah, he was very pissed and hurt by the critics. And I agree. Look, I love The Thing. I think The Thing is a
Mm.
masterpiece. It may be my favorite film of his. It's certainly way up there. And I feel really badly that although actually now I feel great because it's been rediscovered, as a lot of films in film history have. I mean, a lot of the movies that we think of as the best movies, like, were not necessarily big hits in their time. Some of them were, but some of them were like, they took 30 years for somebody to go, hey, that's really good. And I think, John was just way ahead of his time with that movie. I mean, again, I feel like there's a super dark sense of humor that everyone completely missed. I mean, everybody's going on and on about like, oh, it's so gross. And I thought it was hysterically funny. I think all those effects, I mean, the head upside down with the legs. And I mean, it's kind of, I mean, again, there's a playfulness to his work to me that is a huge part of it. And if you miss that he's doing this kind of harmonious Bosch over the top craziness, then I guess it's really bloody and gross. But it's bloody and gross to sort of an end. And also to me, that movie had some really heavy ideas about,
Mhm.
you know, everything from guilt to responsibility to human nature. And I just felt like everyone just missed it. And now it's become a critical darling, and it's been re-released on video a billion times, and it's found its people. But I felt really bad for him. But he didn't bring that onto the set of Christine at all. I mean, he was in a good mood. I think he was in his element. He was working with crew that he knew. He was working with he was on a budget that he felt in control of. He was the one making the decisions. He didn't have to answer to anybody. So I think he was enjoying the process. I mean, he would talk about his disappointment. I mean, when we would sit and just chat, he'd talk about how hurt that he was by the critics and that he really felt pissed and misunderstood. But I didn't feel like he was obsessing or dwelling on it. I mean, he probably did right after it happened. I mean, you got to remember this, by the time you go through that and then you go on, you get the movie set up, there had been a chunk of time. So I think it still hurt him, but I don't think it was raw the way it probably was. I mean, probably people said who knew him well, if they said he was losing his mind right after, I'm sure they might be true. I mean, but then you pick yourself up and you move on. It's grieving like anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me just say, if you want to join the stream to ask Keith a question, those links are available now to my patrons and channel members. So go ahead, hop into the green room. We'll go into the Q&A portion here shortly, and then I'll make that link available to everyone else here shortly. Was Carpenter approachable if you had questions about your character?
I mean, he was he loved to talk about stuff. We talked a lot about the character, he was very different than De Palma in terms of his mode. Brian's very intellectual. Brian would love to talk philosophy for hours, and John's whole thing is looser. He was more just the way he talked about stuff was less heady and more gut. But he still, we talked a lot about the character, and the character evolved. We had a rehearsal period, and ideas came and went, and he was very supportive of me playing with things and trying things. But he was also very willing to go, yeah, that doesn't work. He's the first to say, yeah, try it. But he'd also be the first to say, oh, no, that sucks. Don't do that. But as an actor, that was still a blast because, and then that was something that he and De Palma both did have in common, is that they were very open to actors bringing stuff, which, people don't think of that. They think of, directors of genre particularly often as being very controlling. And it's like, well, they're controlling of the big image, but they also, the good ones, I think, also appreciate what an actor brings, what other people, production designer brings, they want their collaborators to bring stuff. They just want to control the big picture. So John had a very clear sense of what he wanted, just like Brian did, but he also was delighted to have me try things. And often both of them would we do a take a certain way and they go, great, we've got that. Now let's try what happens if you're even more pissed off, or what happens if you play a little bit more for laughs, or what happens, they were very both into using the set to experiment with the actors and with the way the scene played. And that for an actor is delightful. I mean, that's what you kind of wish for.
Was he also open to you kind of looking over his shoulder and picking his brain about,
yes,
why are you doing this?
He teased me to death as I mean, Brian was more serious about it. Brian was more of a teacher's personality. John was always like, you think you're going to be a director, huh? Okay. What would you do? All right. What lens would you use here? I mean, it was much more kind of big brother, little brother kidding. But in the end of the day, he would let me look through the camera, and he would tell me what lens he was using. And he would let me ask questions. I think he wasn't used to it. I think Brian was more of literally a teacher. Brian had been teaching for years. So I think John enjoyed it. I mean, at least I feel like we had a great relationship. It was really fun. We laughed a lot. But he would tease me. He would we'd be in the middle of shooting something and go what lens do you think I'm on? And so it was really fun. That was, I think, maybe the most fun acting job I ever had. There's certain jobs where you get up in the morning and you're kind of glad to be going to work. That was definitely that, because it was such a good vibe on the set. He'd worked with so many of the people in the crew before. There was none of the Hollywood kind of weird, a lot of movies, you've got the actors, there's a class thing or something. There's the actors are over here and the crew's over there. This was much more, everybody ate together. John would have everybody over to his house on the weekend for a barbecue. And it was just like we were all kids. I mean, it was like we were all making this, it's like he was a first time film director in terms of his energy, and he'd do stuff like steal the just dopey stuff, like steal the windsock off the microphone and hide it and make the poor sound guy go crazy, which in a way was silly and a waste of time, but man, it kept it loose and fun. And again, it just didn't let anybody get all uptight about things. And it was, so I remember thinking, if I ever get to direct, I want my set to feel like this set. I want people to be glad to be there. I want people to feel not scared they're going to get yelled at if something doesn't work. You know, John was pretty zen about, like, if something didn't work, I'd be like, all right, well, what are we going to do? You know, and I think that is an amazing quality for a director to have, because you're problem solving. There's always problems. Something always breaks, an effect doesn't work. Whatever. And you know, if you let it make you crazy, you're going to be miserable, and the crew will be miserable. And John just seemed to refuse to be miserable. I mean, we had all sorts of, you know, the the transmission on the car did not like to work. It was very funny. It has the Fury had like this push button transmission where it's on the dashboard. You push a button to go into gear, and they had killed themselves making these cars work, and there weren't many of them in existence in the world, and they bought up as many as they could and cannibalized them and pieced them together. But still, there's probably 85 takes of me getting into the car at different times and hitting the button to go, and the car would just sit there, and I hit the gas and like nothing would happen. And a lot of directors would have gotten cranky and thrown things and who's responsible. And John just would always laugh and you go, all right, well, let's do it again. You know, it just nothing was ever a big deal. And that was great. And with it came his passion. But man, I thought he was, it never felt like it was a job for hire. That's for sure. I've worked with directors where it felt like, oh yeah, you kind of would rather be somewhere else. And I never for a second felt that with John. He thought so much about everything. And he was working on the music and he was working on, he was pretty deeply invested, I thought.
So a lot of actors fall in love with their co-stars. I guess there wasn't that relationship between you and Christine, right? Or you said you were method. You said you did. You
yes.
were kind of method. So did you fall in love with it?
Well, first of all, I did grow up thinking cars were cool. For a New York boy. I'm a New York City boy, so I mostly grew up on subways. I didn't have a driver's license until I was 18. I didn't, but I always liked cars. I loved racing cars. I would go to the car auto show, and I appreciated Christine. She was cool. And yeah, you do that thing. What actors do, or a lot of actors do, is you substitute. So I did a lot of thinking about my first big love affair in high school. My first huge, I'm over the moon in love, and remember what that felt like, and put that feeling towards the car. Now you're not crazy. People actors say something like this. It's like you're not sitting there thinking, oh, that's really that girl, but you remember what the feeling is like. And then as an actor, you know how to kind of go, okay, well, what if it's like a kid pretending. It's like, well, what if I love this car the way I love that girl, and I just couldn't, all I wanted to do was touch her and hold her and kiss her. And John and I did talk about the sexuality of it and really playing that, because that's something that wasn't, I think, quite as clear in the script. And I said, it should be a love affair. I should be touching her. It's a lover. And so that's, I think, part of where that touch at the end of the V, which is, sort of very vaginal and very sort of explicitly erotically, we were always looking for things like that. We were always looking for, how can we make this a physical relationship, not just something in Arnie's head, but in the way he strokes her and the way he touches her. It's actually physicalized, and that was fun. Those were fun things to find.
And I love the show me scene where she's coming. It's kind of like you're watching her, and like it's like a striptease or something. It's very strangely erotic.
And that was, again, something that I don't know that was that clear in the script, although it was a really good script, but I don't know that it was punched up that way. And that was something that, again, I went to John and said, I think this is her taking her clothes off. I think this is her, and he's like, oh yeah. So yeah, definitely that moment was one of those moments of like, this is a real love relationship. It's not just a fantasy. She was my lover.
Very cool. Very cool. My brother, Jeremy, is a big fan of yours, and he has submitted a video. He wants to ask you a question, and here it is.
Cool.
Do you want to ask Keith Gordon a question?
Yes, back to school.
You want to ask him about back to school?
Yes.
What specifically about back to school?
A funny movie.
Mm-hmm. What specifically do you want to ask him?
Rodney Dangerfield.
Do you have any Rodney Dangerfield stories that you can share with Jeremy?
Well, first of all, thank you for the question, Jeremy. Nice to meet you. It's funny, Rodney was, there's so much with Rodney. he was interesting because Rodney had a really hard life before he succeeded. So he was one of those classic things of the crying clown, where he's super funny, but a lot of that whole, I don't get no respect, that came out of, I think, the way he really felt a lot. He was a guy who was, had a real serious stroke and could get his feelings hurt easily. I think he was defensive, because he had a really hard time. And so he brilliantly turned that all into humor, but he wasn't a guy who just had an easy time of it through his life. I mean, he was selling aluminum siding for a lot of years. So, he was also a walking encyclopedia jokes, which was just trippy. I mean, you'd just be waiting between takes and he would just go. He was like a machine. It was like, and he also was not used to acting. So that was all. One of the things I think about Back to School, the person I think doesn't get enough credit is Alan Metter, who directed it, because Rodney was really scared of seeming vulnerable. He was really scared of having that people would see him as, as a pussy if he like showed that he was like scared or vulnerable or in love or any of the, and it was a very kind of old school image of masculinity that he had, and also being a movie star and being, and what would be okay and what would his fans accept. So Alan had to really seduce Rodney into, Rodney, you should let yourself be vulnerable in this movie in some minutes. You can be funny and wacky, Rodney, but we need those moments where we actually feel for you. And Rodney didn't want to go there. It scared him. And Alan did a great job of really giving Rodney the confidence to be funny 98% of the time. But that 2% of the time where he wasn't, that the movie needed to succeed, that was really Alan taking somebody somewhere they didn't want to go. I mean, he was really, really afraid of that. So I think Alan gets a lot of credit for getting Rodney to be brave. I mean, part of what directors do is you're trying to get the actor to be brave. You can't be brave for them. So he did an amazing job with Rodney on that and really brought his humanity. And Rodney just didn't understand acting too. It's like we would rehearse and like he would say to the Alan director, like, well, when we do this scene, is he going to be on my right or my left? And Alan was like, I don't know. We don't even have a location yet. I need to know. And Alan was like, all right, well, let's just say he's on your left. And even though I was sitting on the right, Rodney started rehearsing the scene, the empty space next to him, instead of looking, because he just was like, he was because as a stand-up, he had everything down. So he wanted to know what he wasn't used to that thing of like having to bounce off people and interact in that way. I mean, he'd done movies, but it still was not the way his brain worked. So it was really fascinating watching him kind of get into slowly the mode of, oh, I'm acting in a movie and what that meant. And he ultimately did a great job, but it was not what his comfort zone was. He definitely was like, this is, I'm much more comfortable on stage telling jokes.
Yeah. Oh, very cool. Thank you for that. Jeremy's going to love that story. Thank you very much. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Legend of Billie Jean. I know we've got some Legend of Billie Jean fans in the chat. That looked like a fun movie to shoot. Was it?
It was a fun movie to shoot. Again, very nice people. I got along well with everybody. Helen was great, and Christian, and everybody. The whole cast was. It was a weird movie at times because more than most movies I worked on, it was a bit of a Hollywood experience where the original script that I signed on to was a little bit more complicated and a little bit more of a satire. Like it was walked more of, I thought, a really good line of being serious and making fun of itself at the same time. Like you were aware that it was kind of all the fair and fair stuff. You get it, but it also kind of had a wink to it. It had a sense of this is all over a motor scooter, and it's kind of like the making of this legend, but it's also kind of silly. And I think the studio got scared of that being too complicated. So as we were doing it, they kept trying to pull back on the sense of humor and on the playfulness and on the satiric side of it, which made it a little confusing because it was kind of like the movie we were making was sort of changing sort of as we were making it. So from inside, it wasn't a huge problem or anything, but I hadn't had that experience before. I'd worked with much more auteur directors. Nobody's coming around. I mean, John particularly did Christine with like no studio, so he wouldn't have to listen to anybody. De Palma was De Palma. He was like, yeah, I'm De Palma. I'll take your notes, but I'm going to make the movie I'm going to make. So I wasn't used to somebody who was getting calls going, yeah, change that whole feeling, and not being able to go, oh no, I don't want to. So there was a little bit of weirdness while we were making the film, going, well, what movie are we making? Because I thought we were making a movie where we were kind of making fun of these kind of movies a little bit while we were doing one. And it was a little bit more like, I don't know, the Hard Day's Night thing of like, you're making a movie that's spoofy and real. And that was weird. But in the end, it still was a good time. It was a fun character to play. And, again, everybody there was really nice. And so I enjoyed it. But it was, I think there was an even better movie that never got made, which I was sort of sad about. Because when I first read that script, I loved the script. And I felt like they just took kind of some of the sophistication out of it. I think it was a more sophisticated mashup of genres when we started. So it was a bit of a mixed experience on that front, but doing it was great.
Very cool. At what point did you begin to take serious strides toward directing? And was there a particular reason why you chose that point in time to make your move?
Well, the point in time thing was really just opportunity presenting themselves. I knew from very early on I wanted to go there, but I didn't know how to go that direction. And the first step I took was going way back to home movies. I worked with Mark Romanek, who went on to become one of the biggest and best video directors in the world. He's like won Best Video Awards like over and over and over again. He's made some wonderful movies. And he at that point was pretty young too, and he wanted to make a first feature. And so he and I were buddies and hanging out, and he said, well, maybe we should do a film together, and we could sort of write it together. He had a very little sketch for a beginning of an idea, and we could write together. You could play the lead, and he knew I wanted to get into filmmaking, so we could produce it together. And so we did, and we spent a long time writing the script, and then even longer raising money, which is for these kind of independent movies, that's where the time goes. And then we got to make the film. I was a co-producer on it, and I co-wrote the screenplay, and so I was very much involved with the whole production side of it. So that was the first step, and that was like 1983 through 86 that we were working on that before it finally was done. So I was continuing to take work as an actor, but I had that project kind of going along and finding itself in the world, and I was involved with everything from helping put the cast together to helping with distribution to and getting an education and all that. And then that little film, which is called Static, it actually did very well in Europe. It got great reviews in England. It played it like for months at an art house there. And, in the US, the response was more mixed. It was okay, but it didn't really get a lot of attention. But this one guy, Jonathan Caine, who was a young producer with a management company at that point, he was managing John Travolta. Saw that little movie called Static, and went, I love this movie. And I'm sorry people didn't see more of it. And what else do you have? And so I said, well, like everybody in Hollywood, what I really want to do is direct. And I brought up this book, The Chocolate War, which was a book that I had always loved and felt could be done as an independent film really well. Like it was very contained. It would all take place in and around a school. I just felt like you could do it great for not a lot of money. And it had also sold almost 1 million copies over the years. So I could do a good pitch of saying, if I make this movie and it's even just in focus and, and we keep the budget low enough, you're going to get your money back. Because there's enough people who are going to be curious because the book is a huge success. It's taught in schools. It's, that you can't lose money. And part of what Jonathan owned at that point was a video distribution company. So he knew that if I just sell videos of this thing, and that was back when like a VHS tape would wholesale for $89. Again, people don't remember, it's changed so much now. But when VHS first was coming out, there'd be these rental stores, mom and pop rental stores, and it would cost them $89 to buy the one copy they put in their store with thousands of these stores. So you sell, 10,000 copies at $89. That's a decent amount of money. Mm-hmm. So he kind of knew, a really well-known title, low budget, we can do this. So he basically gave me the shot to adapt and direct the film, and it was remarkable. He was so supportive. I mean, basically, he's like, if you go over budget, I'll break your arms. But, other than that, artistically, he really gave me complete freedom. I was so spoiled because he was like, he didn't want to control what I was doing. He just said, don't spend too much money. So I was able to make a film really on the terms I wanted to make it on, which often doesn't happen. And I got to be involved again with everything beginning to end. I helped design the poster. I helped decide what theaters we went to. Because we were trying to, it was an art house kind of movie. So, we talk about, he hired a guy who was an expert in the field, and he'd tell me about the different theaters in Denver. And we'd sort of go, well, maybe we should target this theater and see if we can get it in there. And so it was stuff that you normally never get involved with as a director. And it was so interesting. And that was how I got to make the first film. It was, again, as much luck as anything. He happened to see my little tiny movie that nobody saw. He happened to love it. He happened to have money to make films. And so I was being in the right place at the right, and I happened to have a project that appealed to him. So it was, could easily could not have happened.
Mhm. Do you find that actors want to work with you as you come from acting? I ask because your first two films, The Chocolate War and A Midnight Clear, were both cast with some pretty heavy hitters, A Midnight Clear in particular.
Well, I think actors know that if an actor is directing, they're going to be understood. I do think there's, a comfort zone. I mean, acting's really scary. I mean, people don't think about it, but I don't care if you're a movie star who's been around forever. You're still standing in front of a camera, sometimes a foot away from your face, catching every single thing you're doing. You're going to be projected up in front of a whole huge group of people. And if you do something stupid, like, there's nowhere to hide. If you don't give a good, it's very vulnerable. And I think a lot of directors who've never acted don't always understand that. So they can get impatient with actors. They can take an actor being jittery or even upset as an actor being difficult or acting out. And I'd been there enough to go like, oh, I know why you're freaking out. I know how scary this is. I know how vulnerable it is. I know how difficult that job is. So, and I think actors appreciate that with an actor turned director, that you can talk their language. Now, that said, every actor is different. I mean, I've been directing now for whatever, 30 years, however long it's been. No two actors are alike. And part of your job as director is really being a psychologist, is really figuring out, what does this actor need? Because there are some actors that need you to hold their hand through everything. There are some actors that really need space and really need you not to say much of anything at all unless something's really wrong. There's some actors who love to talk and be intellectual and analyze. There's some actors, if you do that with, they will freeze up. It'll just completely catch them in their heads. And so the biggest part of my job as a director, in terms of working my actors, is learning them and learning what they need from me. I teach a lot at the Sundance Lab and stuff, and I've taught. And one of the things I always try to impart to young directors is, like, your job isn't to get to actors to work your way. Your job is to figure out what they need and work their way. Because what you really want is the best work out of everybody around you. And that's your actors, and that's also your crew. I mean, every cinematographer is different. And so your job is to, as fast as you can, figure out, what does this person need from me to do their best work. Probably like a teacher in school or something. You have to figure out every kid. If you just took some blanket approach to 30 kids in your classroom, work for some, not work for others, and that's not going to make things go as well as you'd want. So I think actors felt good with that. I also think I had good material. I think a lot of the reason I got some of the good actors I got wasn't so much me; it was the scripts were good, and the scripts were good because I adapted really good books. Most of the films I made were adaptations and were things I adapted, but I never had any ego as a writer. Like, I never thought of myself as a writer. I thought of myself as a filmmaker who wrote to tell the story. So when I adapt a book, I don't start changing everything to prove how smart I am or prove it's I mean, a lot of adaptations I feel like I read in Hollywood are people changing everything just for the sake of changing everything so that they can put their stamp on it. Like, for me, I had no interest in that, because I'm not going to try to write better than William Morton, who wrote Midnight Clear. He's a great novelist. Like I want to steal everything from him I possibly can. So because of that, I think the scripts came out well, because they were really good books, and I was just trying to capture the book the best that I could. And actors are smart about material. When they know when a role is juicy or a story is a good story, and a lot of stuff out there isn't that interesting. So when I came to people, even if I didn't have much money, I spent all my time going, I can't pay you what you're worth, but we'll have a good time. And this is a really juicy role, and I was lucky to mostly get people I wanted.
Cool. We're starting to wind down a little bit here. I've only got a handful of questions left. We've got somebody already waiting in the green room, and we've got some questions from the audience that I've compiled. I'm about to share the link, so if you want to jump on and ask Keith a question, I've just posted that link in the chat. A couple of things I'm going to continue talking to you about here very soon. Mother Night, of course, I definitely want to talk about that. And I want to talk to you about your work in television. But I've got my buddy Stone in the green room, and he wants to jump on and ask you a question. So, Stone, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you both doing?
Hey, Stone.
Doing great.
How you doing?
You've got it.
Oh, yes.
Go ahead. You got
please.
Yeah, I got a quick question. I'm not going to be too long, but Mr. Gordon, look, I adore your entire resume. I've seen your movies multiple times. I mean, The Legend of Billie Jean, Dress to Kill. But look, the truth of the matter is that in 2007, I discovered The Chocolate War. I loved your audio commentary on this movie. I mean, I loved how you talked about how The Shining influenced you with many, many shots. I loved everything that you talked about with The Chocolate War on this movie. And I plan on doing my own audio commentary for The Chocolate War tonight at 9 p.m. on my channel, because more people need to see it. But here's my one question, and you don't address it in your commentary, and that's why I want to ask you. What was the author's reaction to the movie, even with the changes to the ending?
He was very happy with the movie. He struggled with the ending. He liked his original ending, and I understood that. But I also I explained to him why I felt it didn't work cinematically and why I made the change. And he was certainly very respectful of that. We had a really good dialogue, even though it wasn't, it wasn't what he would have done. I think he understood that in terms of working as a cinema piece, it worked for me better, and why, and that I was trying to be true to what the underlying tone was. But that, and I think if I'd stuck a happy ending on the movie, I think he would have been really pissed. I think that would have been, he said, at least you didn't go Hollywood on it. You did. But to me, it was just a little bit more subtle, because I personally feel like a lot of damage in the world is about systems. It's not about the individual. Like, I feel like whatever is a political system, an economic system, a religious system, that it's the system that becomes self-perpetuating, and it uses the people in it and chews them up. And that, to me, I always saw Archie as much as a victim of that system ultimately as Jerry. And so to me, that was a more interesting thing to say than just, well, Archie was bad. That, to me, that's a little easy. And when I wrote my first draft that way, and it just felt very unsatisfying. It felt like the movie, and the book is different because the book you can go deeper into things, but the script read a little bit like life sucks and then you die. And I thought that's not enough to kind of make a movie about. And so to say, maybe it's more interesting to make a movie about, be careful when you rebel that you're not doing exactly what the system wants you to do. Because to me, that's a much more interesting question in life, is like, when we try to change things, are we changing them, or are we actually feeding into the very thing we want to fight against? And that, to me, was a really interesting, open moral question, as opposed to just, this guy's bad, that guy's good. So that was, for me, what I was trying to do. But, Cormier was, again, like I said, he was very respectful, but he was like, well, I just feel like, Archie would never let him, I don't want to give away the ending too much, but basically he felt like it wouldn't have happened that way. And I respect that as well. But it was not a harsh or difficult disagreement, but it was an honest and heartfelt one.
Yes.
By the way, just if you're going to be talking about the film, which I'm very glad, there is a plan for a Blu-ray version. Finally coming out, I think, this summer. It all seems to be moving along. I think MVD, who's done a bunch of interesting sort of odd movies over the years, a lot of genre stuff, but some not. And they happen to be a fan of it, and we seem to be on track with it. I mean, it seems to be moving forward, and I'm always very nervous, because in this business, you always can have that and then have it fall apart. But they're being lovely to work with and to deal with, and it seems like it's moving forward well.
Very cool.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Gordon. And finally, last but not least, it is because of your commentary that I finally saw Harold and Maude, and it's now my number 3 movie of all time.
I'm so glad.
All time.
I am so glad.
I'll put him
and introduce that to a new generation of film goers too, because I meet young film people who don't know about Harold and Maude, and damn, that's a great movie. So
I did a commentary on it last year. I'm going to put in Piz's chat my Chocolate War commentary link for tonight. Thank you so much, Mr. Gordon. Thank you.
A pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure to meet
Thanks.
you, sir.
Thanks, Stone. Great questions, man. Take care, buddy. Harold and Maude. Yeah, let's get the word out about Harold and Maude. Why not? And the chocolate war. I'm glad that MVD does good releases, so I'm sure
Yeah.
they'll do the chocolate war.
Yeah, no, and
justice.
they've been so nice to deal with. I've had the video world's its own weirdness, and I've had movies come out that nobody even bothered to call me. I mean, much less let me look at it and see if I think it looks right or whatever. I've just been like, I've found out certain films I've made have come out when I like saw an ad or saw like something on Blu-ray.com or something, which is
Yeah.
weird. But MVD has been great. They reached out to me. They want me to look at it, make sure I think it looks right. They talked about the advertising. I mean, they've been very inclusive and just really nice.
That's awesome. Yeah, I understand that you really wanted Nick Nolte to star, or just to simply read Mother Night. However, you were having difficulty actually getting it in his hands, so you took a rather unique route to
Yes.
make that happen. How did
Yes,
you?
it's a good story, and again, how luck plays a part in our world. Mother Night's this Kurt Vonnegut novel that I was trying to make into a film. I was working with my best friend Bob Whitey, who wrote the script. We were producing it together. It was, and basically, it's a great leading role. And there was a company that wanted to finance it, and they basically said, "There's 3 actors in the world that we'll finance this with," and Nick was one of them. And Nick had always been like our first choice, but we tried to get it to Nick, and his agents were like, "Nick's salary is like 3 times what you're talking about making the whole movie for." And this is before Nick started doing more independent films. He was like one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. So we couldn't get it anywhere near him. And so we went on to the other people on their list who also were like, they wouldn't even look at it, or their agents wouldn't let them look at it because they were all huge, And so basically out of left field, a casting director who I knew said, "I'm casting this movie, I Love Trouble, and we're trying to get sort of interesting, weird people in like small parts." And I was like, "Well, I'm not acting much anymore." And she said, "Well, I just thought, it's Julia Roberts and Nick Nolte." And I was like, "Oh, I'm not too busy. Is there anything where Nick Nolte is in a scene?" And she's like, "Well, yeah. I mean, there's a reporter, a train wreck." I'm like, "Yeah, I might do that." And basically, I took this one-line part of Andy the photographer. Luckily, it was this huge train wreck sequence, so I was there for night after night, even though I only had the one line. And I kind of got to talking to Nick's assistant, because I didn't want to just go up to Nick and start saying, "I got a script for you to read," because I thought he'd probably just punch me. I mean, I don't know. He'd think I'm some crazy person. But his assistant actually knew my work. He knew Chocolate War. He knew Midnight Clear. And so he was willing to say to Nick, "You actually should look at this. It's Kurt Vonnegut. You like Kurt Vonnegut. This guy actually makes good movies." And so basically, I talked to Nick, but he also talked to Nick, and Nick was like, "Yeah, just give me the script." Yeah. And I was like, it was so amazing. And then, of course, I didn't hear anything for months. I thought, okay, that didn't work, and I was depressed and miserable. So I called the assistant, and the assistant was like, "Listen, Nick loses everything. Just send it to me again. I'll make sure he reads it." So I did. Again, another 6 weeks go by or something. And at this point, I'm like, "Oh, this is never." I kind of moved on in my head, and we were never going to get the movie made. And I come home, and on my answering machine one night is Nick sounding like Nick, going, "Hey, Nick, I love the script. This is great. I'd love to do this." And I actually thought maybe it was my partner on the project, Bob, was like calling it, making a joke, because like it was like I didn't expect it to be a message on my machine, but it was Nick, and he ended up doing the movie, and it was an amazing experience. And I think he really liked it, because after that he started doing a lot of smaller films. After that he did Affliction. He did, I think he rediscovered how much fun it was to work on something where he could just stretch himself as an actor. But man, talk about a brilliant person to work with, and talk about taking something off the page and making it alive. But I took basically a one-line part, and it happened to work. And probably that movie would never have gotten made. I mean, probably it would still be on my shelf of get done one day projects.
That's very cool. That's very cool. We've got a friend of mine in the chat. I'm sorry, in the green room. Joe Bob wants to jump on and ask you a question, Keith. Joe Bob, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. How you doing, Keith?
Hey.
I wanted to ask one question. How did you get involved with one of my favorite shows, Dexter? And were you familiar with the books before that?
Basically, how I got involved with Dexter, I was not familiar with the books. What happened was I read an article in Variety about this show, and I thought it sounded like the coolest thing I'd ever. I thought, that sounds amazing, and that sounds like something I would love. And so I contacted me, and I hadn't done a lot of TV at that point. I'd done a little bit, but I wasn't like an in-demand TV director or anything. So I called my agents, and they said, well, if you want, we can send you the pilot. They already made the pilot, and you can see if you like it. And they sent it me, and I thought it was amazing. I thought the pilot was brilliant. I thought Michael Questa directed it, did an incredible job. I thought Michael C. Hall was brilliant. I was like, I have to work on the show. And so my agent said, well, listen, they've got all the directors for the first season, you've done less TV than most of the kind of people they're looking at. And I was like, can you just get me in a meeting with them? I mean, can I just talk to them? And they managed to get me in a room with them. And I talked at length about how passionate I was about it, why I loved it. And as luck would have it, again, that big word luck, a director fell out, which happens in TV. They had a different job, they got a feature going, whatever. And the 10th episode, or 11th, whatever, the second to last episode of that first season, they said, we need somebody. And, we really like what you said. We liked your passion. So, why don't you come do it? And I did, and it went great. And I had a great time, and they were real happy. And so then they started asking me after that, with TV, they like to build every show likes to have a stable of directors because it makes everybody feel good. They know they can deliver. The actors know them. Everybody feels comfortable. So once you get in with the show, often you can go back and back and back as much as you feel like. And that's what happened with Dexter. I ended up doing 10 of them over the next years, but only because I got in a room and told them how much I loved their show. And then somebody happened to drop out. If that person hadn't dropped out, probably never would have done Dexter, which means I probably would never gotten to do any of the other TV stuff I did. So,
again, Lady Luck. Hartsville, my home state. I'm from North Carolina, so that's actually kind of unique. And of course, Christine, my mom got me into that movie. I don't know why. As a little kid, I thought it was incredible.
How young were you?
About 6 or 7.
Oh, that's young. Oh, wow.
I wasn't phased by it, Keith. I was like, dang, that's pretty cool.
Well, good.
Joe Bob wasn't, he's with it. But Joe Bob, thank you for jumping on and asking that question.
Thank you, Joe. Hey, Mr. Gordon and Anna. My mom's not going to believe this. So
well, say hi for me.
Thank you, sir. Take care.
All right, we'll see you, Joe Bob. Take care, man. He mentioned Dexter and television, and the landscape for independent film has changed dramatically since you directed Mother Night and Waking Dead. Both great films. I'd highly recommend anyone watching this, by the way. I read an interview with John Waters a few years ago in which he said basically, there's no room for independent film in Hollywood anymore. Right around this same time, there seemed to be a boom in episodic cable television with shows like Dexter, Breaking Bad, Sons of Anarchy, and so on, they were episodic cable television, but they were very cinematic in nature. And of course, you've directed a lot of television, what I would consider prestige television, like Joe Bob mentioned, Dexter, Fargo, so on and so forth. Do you think that indie filmmaking and that indie spirit just moved to television?
I think a lot of it did, yeah. I think, getting indie films financed and released got harder and harder. And luckily, at the same time, and it's chicken or the egg, TV got bolder and bolder with things that felt, as you said, more cinematic, more complicated, more brave storytelling, both in terms of the story and the way they were told. So it was great because a lot of us did sort of migrate from independent features into directing TV because it was a place that we could bring what we did well. TV is like making a low budget movie. It's a tight budget, tight schedule. So, it's hard, I think, sometimes for people who direct big Hollywood movies to transition to TV because they're not used to doing that many pages in a day and having to think fast. But for those of us who are used to making movies for not much, it's kind of similar. But the writing in TV is so good. I've been lucky enough to work on shows like Dexter and Fargo and Homeland, where the writing is on a really high level. So you're working with great material and great actors. And I think a lot of us that would be directing independent movies now make a living doing good television. I'd love to go back and forth more easily. I'd love to, and I think movies continue to evolve. What's happening in movies, I think, is that the tiny budget movie is kind of finding its way in the world more. I think the rise of people being able to shoot a movie on their iPhones and have it look good. I mean, there have been features now done literally with like no crew, no lights. So, and I think that's sort of going to be the future of independent filmmaking because financially it's such a rough road now for an independent movie. There's no distributors really putting them out there. When they get out there, they hardly ever have a theatrical life. They have, video doesn't pay nearly what it once paid. I mean, for people who are interested in like the business part of all of my movies when I was getting to make features in the 80s and 90s, and that would basically, the video would kind of cover you. You knew no matter what, nobody's going to get hurt. Now video doesn't have that same value. Streaming has some value, but they don't pay the same kind of money, so the budget has to be real small for an independent financier to know they're going to get their money back. It has to be hundreds of thousands, not millions. Now, that doesn't mean somebody won't take a flyer on something and spend $4 or $5 million if they think it's great, but it means they're taking a flyer. It means somebody's being very brave and bold and saying, I believe in this material so much, I'm investing this money, and I have no guarantees up front I'm going to get it back. And that's harder. It was easier when you could say to somebody, even if I make a bad movie, you're going to get 80% of your investment back. Now it's 30% if it's a $5 million movie, 20%. So you're asking somebody to take a much bigger chance. But with the rise of these kind of, people having drones, I mean, I'm seeing shots in movies that are made for $100,000 that we couldn't have done on a feature, so nobody could have done on a feature that was $50 million 30 years ago, because no equipment existed that would do that. Even a helicopter couldn't do some of those things. So I think it's opened up a new avenue, and in some ways it's democratized filmmaking. I mean, I'm seeing a lot more films from North Carolina, where Joe Bob was from all over the place. It's not just LA and New York. And I think that's a great thing, because I think there's voices all over the country that have stuff to say. So I think that's terrific. It's still hard to get them out. The hard thing isn't making the film now, because if you can piece together just a little bit of money, you can actually make a pretty damn good movie. But there's not a lot of process yet to get those films in front of people. And I'm hoping that'll keep developing so that there'll be more outlets, so that, if some guy in Iowa makes a special movie, at least it has a real chance to get seen, and it doesn't have to rely on, like every year so many films go to Sundance and one or two get all the attention, but there's a lot of other great movies that just don't. So, and I know, because I get to see some of them. Some people just send them to me because they know I might be interested or whatever, and I'll see things, and that's got to keep changing. But it's hard. But that small but not tiny kind of film that I was mostly working in the $1 million to $5 million range is just deadly right now, because the economics don't work. And at the end of the day, it's somebody's money. It isn't my money, so I can be all arty and everything, but it's somebody's money, and I feel empathetic. People want to manage their risk.
Right. Well, we have one other person in the green room. I believe you may know this gentleman. He is a fellow filmmaker. It's Jamie Blanks. How you doing, Jamie?
Oh, hey, how are you?
Hey, brother, good to see you, mate.
Good to see you.
I've been enjoying your interview. It's been fascinating listening to you talk about your career like this with Justin. I got up early. It's sort of early in the morning in Australia, so
I
got
bet
up to listen to this. It's been really interesting, mate.
Well, I'm glad. How are you?
I'm really good. Things are getting busy again, which is great. We had some of the longest lockdowns in the world in Australia, so we fortunately, being an editor, if it was an Olympic sport, we could isolate for Australia, and so. But it's been nice things are starting to ramp up again, and things are getting busy again. So yeah, it's nice to be emerging out of that whole world.
Cool.
Well, and I have to give a shout out here to Jamie, because Jamie helped to make this happen. So
you mentioned many times you wanted to speak to Keith, and I said, well, I have met Keith once, and he's a very lovely guy, and I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you at some stage. So I'm glad it worked out.
I am too. Thank you for setting it up, because this is good.
Hey, no worries, man.
Yeah,
it's been so interesting hearing you talk about your TV career too, because I had so many things I wanted to ask you that day where we met at your house, but you had to do an on-camera interview. There was only so much time, so it was actually quite nice today to sit back and actually get some of the answers that I've been wanting to hear about your career, Keith.
Well, you can always also just reach out to me too. It's like,
Yeah. No, I actually wanted to ask you. It was interesting hearing you talk about lessons that you might have picked up from Brian and from John on the set. And are there any specific things beyond the kind of sort of tone that they'd like to have on their sets? Is there any sort of techniques that you picked up from either of those guys that you find yourself coming back to frequently?
Sure. Well, I mean, one thing that I kind of alluded to it, but I didn't really go into it. I mean, the tone thing is a big part of it, and that was particularly John Carpenter, but also the way they work with actors in terms of using multiple takes to get choices in the editing room. Both of them did that in their own way. But, I think a lot of directors that I've seen and been around, and, again, they'll do 6 or 7 or 8 takes or whatever, but they'll just do the same thing over and over. And the actor's going,
Right.
I don't know what do you want different? And everybody's confused, or everybody gets in the other habit from TV of doing one take, and if like the walls don't fall down, you move on. Which is
Right.
because you have to move so quickly. And what I learned from Brian and John, and I've even tried to take it even into TV where nobody thinks you have time, but what really, what really takes time on a movie set is setting it up. Like once you've moved all the lights and changed the set, and once you're there, that's what takes the time. Shooting the scene a couple of times doesn't kill you. So yeah. Even with TV, I've gotten very insistent on trying to do extra takes and make sure the actors have tried all the things that they have inside them, because actors are naturally going to be nervous and they're going to start kind of safe probably. And once they get going, they might show you different things. So I've learned from both Brian and John in different ways to make sure you get the extra takes, and then push people to say like, hey, dude, we've got the great version where you're really pissed off. Now maybe do a version where you hide how pissed off you are, right. Now maybe do a version where you try to laugh off the whole thing. Yeah, you found out your wife was cheating on you, but like try to really make me believe that you don't care. Because when you're on, you don't know when you get in an editing room how all the pieces are going to fit together. When you're making a movie, you're making a jigsaw puzzle.
That's
and
right,
so what both Brian and John would do, and Brian particularly would do this, is give themselves more different pieces to take into the editing room, different takes, different levels, so that they could then see, oh, this, because somebody can be great on a set, somebody can seem brilliant and make everybody cry. But if that level of their performance doesn't fit with the scene before or after, it may not work in the final film.
Right.
Good is a relative thing. And something that looks great on the set may not be great in the final movie. So Brian was really good at making sure he had a range of choices about how a scene might play. And that was a huge lesson. I mean, I really have taken that seriously, and I've always tried to do it, even in TV, even when the clock is ticking. I'll always say, hey, let's do one more. And I'll come up with something different so that there's some choice in editing. And I'll always say to the actor, especially if I know the actor is a creative thinker, like, what's the thing that you don't think will be okay that you want to do? What's the thing you're scared of that you think might be dopey? And I promise you, it won't be used if it's dopey. But sometimes those are the best choices of all. And so those are the biggest single things. I mean, sure, I learned about lenses and cameras and all that, but that was more of a technical learning curve. But watching with actors, and it's funny because people don't think of Brian or John, the first thing they don't think of is actors. But there's a reason that so many actors want to work with them over and over again. There's a reason that, so many actors have come out of their films and gone on to amazing careers, because they actually love and give that generosity to actors to do the best work. So that was probably the single biggest thing.
It's pretty amazing too, Christine, that you've got the two male leads in that film have both gone on to become directors.
It's very trippy. That is very, very trippy. And it's kind of great. Maybe that was John's influence.
I'm sure John takes all the credit in the world for that.
But I will say, that John Stockwell, even back then, was saying, well, I'd really like to move into filmmaking. And I mean, it was something clearly it was in part of his personality. I think a lot of actors have some of that. I mean, look, Maggie Gyllenhaal just made her first film and got an incredible amount of attention. I mean, I think a lot of actors, especially like smart actors, we see the process and we go, oh, well, as an actor, I'm just a small part of the process. But it's not that different a process than what I do. As an actor, you're building this character and piecing it together. And, directing is just taking that and doing it for the whole thing. So I think actors are often very good directors, because they're thinking, it's a somewhat similar way of thinking. It's just expanding it out. But we're very familiar with how a set works, and we know what actors need. And we know it. A lot of writers have turned into good directors, but it's a tricky transition. I've worked with a lot of writers turning because they don't have the on-set experience. They know what's in their head.
Yeah.
But I think young directors who are writers can often get really frustrated because they don't realize that it's never going to be like in your head. Whatever that thing you see, it may be better or it may be worse, but it's not going to be the thing you see. It's just there's too many other people involved. And I think actors know that.
There'll be a compromise of some description involved in the process. And I think a lot of writers sometimes might struggle with that because they have internalized the thing so much in their mind.
And it's understandable. They were alone in a room, and so they picture it that way, and they picture any actor or no actor, or the actor, they create an imaginary actor, and then it's very frustrating for them when it's not that thing. Whereas as an actor yourself, it's never going to, whenever you're an actor and you start to do a scene, it's never going to end up like you start. It's always things are going to happen. And I think writers can turn into brilliant directors, but I think there's a process that I think actors often have a head start on, accepting, oh yeah, you do all your homework, but you do all your homework so that you can let go and not know what's going to happen, as opposed to doing all your homework so that you can try to nail everything down and not let it move.
And working between film and television, Keith, beyond kind of like the time constraints, because like I've done features in 50 days. I've done I did 2 features in Australia, but I had more time to shoot my first American film than I did to have those 2 films combined. Beyond the kind of the time difference between the 2 mediums, is there anything you find kind of different about the experience? Do you prefer one over the other for any other reason?
Well, it's actually a very different experience, because when you do a TV show, unless you're the executive producer, creator, it's really not yours. It's more like being the conductor of the orchestra than the composer of the music. Like when I come into somebody's TV show, my job isn't to make myself happy, it's to make them happy. And I always say that to showrunners when I come on. I say, I get it. I get that at the end of the day, if I like my episode and you don't, I've failed. Mm-hmm. And if I don't like my episode and you do, I've succeeded. Because my job, you are hiring me to fulfill your vision. So that's a different thing. When I make my own movie, it's about pleasing me. So obviously on a certain level, that's always going to be more soul satisfying, because it's something that I've carried, I've given birth to, I may have written it, or I worked with the writer, and it's my vision. At the end of the day, I'm the one who says, this is right, this is wrong. When I work on a TV show, my job is to figure out what it is they want. And sometimes some showrunners aren't even that articulate about it, because again, they're writers, they haven't spent a lot of time on movie sets, they don't know how you get certain things. So they'll have to just talk in general, I just want to make sure it feels more like Jaws than like, Close Encounters. And you have to kind of go, okay, what do they mean? And how do I try to do that for them? So it's an interesting job. It's an interesting puzzle, but you are in service of, it's like the difference between an architect and a contractor. As a contractor, you might do, if you're a great contractor, you might say, hey, I think the architect's wrong. I think you want to put the bathroom over there. You could get to be a part of it, but there's still an architect. And a good TV show, especially a good TV show, is going to have an architect. And it ain't going to be you, the director. It's going to be the showrunner, creator, who's got this big vision. And your job is to add the salt and spices to make that maybe a little better, but you have to stay within what they want.
And is that the primary relationship you have is with the showrunner and not so much the other directors of that season you might be working on? Is there any kind of collaboration with the other directors?
Very rarely do you get to collaborate with the other directors, because you're all doing such different things at the same. The thing about a TV show is so much is going on at once. They're shooting one episode while you're preparing your episode. Usually, so you're off looking at locations while they're shooting the next one, and they're editing one before. So I've done shows with some amazing directors that I've never met until like 2 years later. I happen to run into them. It's like, oh, we both worked on, the Leftovers or whatever.
Right.
So really the relationship is with the showrunner. And then depending on how that showrunner works, it might be with the individual writers, because every show, or almost every show, has a showrunner who's like the head of it all, and the chief writer often. But then there's a team of writers. And some showrunners give more power to the individual writers who wrote that individual episode. So you might be working, like, for example, on a show like Homeland, they would delegate a good amount of the on-set authority to the writer of that episode. And they would be the one there with you, kind of watching what was going on and saying, oh, I think you're getting away from where we want to go. Or, hey, two episodes later, this twist is going to happen. So you have to make sure you're setting it up here, and that I might not even know about, because they've only given me the script up to, but on that show, Alex, who was the showrunner, he wanted to stay in the writer's room working on the shows to come. And so the producer writers would come of that episode. Other shows, it's much more, that person's show. There's, whether, a Damon Lindelof or Noah Hawley, I felt like more of my relationship there tended to be with that person, because they were much more like involved with how they wanted each show to feel moment to moment. And that's just the personality of the person running it. It all can work great. But that's part of what's so interesting about TV, is every time you go in, it's kind of got some things the same, but it's also going to be unique as to how that show works.
Right. And I just want to jump back to Christine again quickly. You were talking about how Carpenter liked to give himself those options in the editing room. Did you get to participate much in the post-production part of the movie? Did you get
not on Christine.
Right.
That was where John, I think, was more traditional and was like, yeah, I'm not comfortable with actors watching the dailies. I don't want you adjusting your performance, to something I might like. And I don't want you in the editing room, because I'll feel weird and awkward if I have to say that doesn't work. And, so I got to I hung around when they were doing the scoring, because I loved John's music, and he was fine with that. But I didn't get to and I guess I saw some semi-early cuts of the movie, but I didn't, Brian was, just because of his personality, much more comfortable with me coming to dailies, and I think just wasn't afraid that I was going to screw up my performance or whatever, and hang out.
Right.
But that's just a personality thing. And there's been arguments from the beginning of time as to whether it's good or bad to let actors see dailies. And now it's all different anyway, because there's no little videotapes or a link or
yeah.
I mean, it used to be Robert Altman was famous for these like parties where they'd have tons of food and everybody would watch the dailies, and I love that because when I shot my features, I would do that because it was a chance for everybody to celebrate their work. And I almost never had an actor freak out who came to the dailies. I mean, the couple of actors who were vulnerable to it were smart enough to go, I don't think I should go. I've had a couple of actors say, I'm worried it would screw me up. And then I'd go, great, well, then I'm glad you said that. But actors, actors get a bad rap. I think most actors are really smart about how they work and what helps them and what doesn't. Very few actors.
I've always liked to show actors my rushes. I've always liked to involve them in that process, and I've always found it's been very helpful. Very rarely would I think that it's ever had a negative impact on that stuff. Actually, Justin had Alan Howarth at one point on his show. I think it was last year or something. And I'm just curious. You said you got to sit in on some of the scoring sessions. That was always my dream as a kid. I'm a composer as well, so I always wanted to be a fly on the wall in some of those sessions. Can you tell a little bit about what that process was like watching John score the film?
Well, it was amazing because it was done so low tech, and it was high tech and low tech. It was all being done on computer, but it was being done like kind of in his basement. It wasn't like some big, And what I remember being most blown away by, because he was really at that point just working through it. They weren't laying it in permanently. They were just he was kind of writing the skeleton of it. And what was so amazing to me was that he would change it on a computer screen. Like he would move the notes, which just just blew my mind. It wasn't like him sitting and playing it. I mean, he did have a keyboard there and he'd play it, but then he'd play it and then he would just go and he would take a note and he would move it up 2 tones. And then it would play it back with that note change. And it was like, oh my God, that's magic. It was like, because I knew nothing about it. So I was like, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen.
Well, that's extremely high tech in 1983.
Absolutely.
I
mean, that's what I mean. It was low tech in that it was relaxed and it was like, it was just kind of, hey, come in, have a beer. But then he's like, he was doing it. I think it was probably an Apple computer, because Apple was a thing that he was using creatively at that point. And it was amazing. It was, and then occasionally if you really wanted to change something, he could do it on the keyboard again. But watching him make pauses longer or different, or literally changing some notes and just watching pieces of music forming was, I mean, to me, that was like magic. That was like, okay, dude, I don't know what you're doing, but like that seems like very
what's lovely coming out of this chat you had with Justin today, Keith, is that your desire to want to soak it all up like a sponge, to be part of this and to see how every aspect of the film was happening, even when you weren't working, you were sticking around to see how the film was put together. I mean, that just sounds like paradise to me. I can totally relate as a movie nerd. What an amazing experience that must have been to be in the middle of all that stuff and just having all that information to soak up.
Well, for all of us who love movies, I mean, they're magical. I mean, it's like what we do is like kind of incredible. It's like we create something out of nothing, and watching how that works. I'm still excited when I go on other people's sets. I'll visit the set. I still feel nervous and excited and like, wow, what are they doing? And it's like, I hope that never goes away. I think when it goes away, it's time to quit. So
exactly.
Well, I know we're about to run out of time here, but I do want to ask you one final question that we had submitted from my audience member Joe Reese. He says, I read Stephen King was writing another Christine book, and Sony has got the rights. Ask Keith if he would direct the sequel to it, or what if they approached you to direct a Christine remake? Would you be interested in either?
It's funny. Probably not. And mostly because I love what John did, and I wouldn't want to try to compete with a film that I loved and was part of. I think that would be very weird. I guess maybe if it was really different, maybe if it just felt like, okay, we could bring something completely different to it. But otherwise, I'd feel, because I think he did it great, so I'd feel obligated to just do an imitation of what he did. I would, or I'd start changing things just to change him up. I'm more interested in remakes generally if I feel like they didn't work. If there's a great book that was blown. So for me, then the sequel would all depend, I guess, on what it was. I mean, if I love the sequel, then sure, that could be potentially interesting. But I think it's really hard when something was terrific. I mean, I actually did a movie that was a remake of a British TV miniseries, and I did it as a film. And a lot of people were like, well, your remake wasn't as good as the miniseries. And I was like, well, you know what? In ways they're right, because I think the original, which was 6 hours, got to go a lot deeper into the story. I mean, I did it because it's one of my favorite authors in the world, Dennis Potter, and he had written the screenplay version. He wrote the TV version. It was called The Singing Detective. Again, an amazing piece if people haven't seen it. The original 6-hour British version is incredible. And I'm proud of my movie, but he did a very shortened version. And yes, it does lose. I mean, I think he rethought it to a certain extent, but I understood why people said, well, the 6 hours give you so much more. So having been through that, it all the more makes me feel like, yeah, be careful about remaking things that were great, because they're great for a reason. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't rush to it. I mean, if they offered me like a part in it, that might be fun. Like, I mean, to get back to acting, I could play Darnell. You know, I could do my best Robert Blossom's imitation, and that could be a blast.
That would be great. That would be great. But Keith, this has been absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being so candid and open. This has been just, oh my God, incredible. Thank you so much.
It was a great interview. So fascinating.
Thank you. You ask great questions and you make it very convivial and easy. And I'll be happy to come back sometime if you want to go and cover more stuff.
I'd love to. Anytime, sir. Anytime.
All right, my friend.
All right.
You have a great one.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Let's touch base. So
I'll be back in LA later this year, so I'll definitely be coming over.
I will see you then.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, brother.
Take care.
Bye, guys.
See you guys. Bye.
See ya. See you, Jamie. See you guys. Oh, goodness gracious. That was awesome. Oh my goodness. Oh, that was fun. Let me do some shout outs here before I call it a night. Shout out here to Devin Lotz. Thank you for the $5 super chat. And let's see who is still with me tonight here. Who is still in the chat? I hope everybody enjoyed this Bloodstream. Let's see. That horror dude, Rock Music Forever 90, Buck 3366, Jamie Hart. How you doing, Jamie? Sheeby GB, Sam, how are you? Wise Guy 100, Robert Long. There's Joe Bob in the chat. Let's see. Sasha, how you doing, Sasha? Scream, my buddy Captain Halloween. Slasher Home Video, Chris, how are you doing? Let's see. Jimmy L324, thank you for watching. Yes, if you haven't dropped a like on the stream, please do so. Scarlett Lyerly, thank you for tuning in. Dirk Jason Hall, thank you. Sarah Perry, Ill Fusion. Let's see who else was with me tonight. DJ Donley, Zach Hall. Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you all enjoyed the show. And yeah. All right. Thanks again. Take care. Drop a like on the stream if you haven't already. Share the stream on social media. And yeah, again, thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate it. Take care. And until next time, peace.